Taoiseach, we warned you when you decided to go through with the cold-hearted decision to lift the no-fault eviction ban on the 1st of April that that would lead to a spike in homelessness. And the figures that came out last Friday, conveniently enough for you before the weekend, but I think we need to consider them, what those figures show is a very significant rise in the level of homelessness in the first month after you lifted the no-fault eviction ban. And worst of all, a very dramatic jump in the number of families and children that are homeless. So we now have a shocking record number of 12,259 people homeless. 3,594 of them are children. And in just the last month, the number of families going into homelessness has increased by 94 families, and 122 of them are children. Children put through the trauma and the hardship of being made homeless because, in many cases, of an eviction where their family have done absolutely nothing wrong and thrown into emergency accommodation. So would you not accept that that has been a disastrous decision? And this is just the beginning, because you staggered the end of the eviction ban. It means it's going to escalate. All the signs are that this already disastrous situation of record numbers of individuals, families, and worst of all, children, is going to increase and increase and increase. So you need to reinstate the eviction ban. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh, we have the tenant in situ scheme. That's what we're doing to stop evictions. Now, first of all, I'd like to remind you, it was the opposition that proposed it. We had to fight with you for 2 years to introduce it. But in many cases, although we're getting some success, it's not working because particularly big investors and corporate landlords, even though they're evicting people on the grounds that they're selling a property, when the local authority approaches them and says, we want to buy it, they're just saying no. So something needs to be done about that. That's what's happening in Tahani House, where 35 families and households are threatened with eviction. The landlord just is ignoring the council. He wants to go through with the eviction and refusing to engage on the issue of purchase. And I've raised other similar cases with you in recent times. So your policies are not working, and it is not rational to say, oh, well, it'll be worse in a few months' time if we reinstate the eviction ban, because that's in a sense suggesting that your own plans to deliver more affordable and public housing are not going to actually be realised.
Thank you, Deputy. Time is up.
So I'm asking you, Taoiseach, will you reinstate the no-fault eviction ban, and will you ensure there is first refusal for local authorities and approved housing bodies who are trying to buy properties to prevent families and children being made homeless?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Thanks. Thanks, Deputy. As I think I indicated to Deputy MacDonald earlier, we've had 2 temporary eviction bans in Ireland, one introduced by the last government, which I led during the pandemic, the other introduced by this government last year. And what do we learn from those 2 eviction bans? At best, they reduce the number of people who are homeless in the short term, and the most recent eviction ban didn't even do that. Homelessness, the number of people in emergency accommodation, continued to rise almost every month that the second eviction ban was in place. So at best, it reduces homelessness in the short term, but probably doesn't even do that. What does it do? It makes it worse in the medium term. When you lift the ban, you have a glut of eviction notices that then get affected. And then the long term, it makes it even worse again, because you've fewer people willing to offer properties for rent in the private rental market. So a policy that at best might work in the short term, but doesn't always, makes things worse in the medium term and in the long term. Doesn't make sense for me to do that a third time for those reasons. What we can do, a tenant in situ scheme, 1,500 homes being bought from landlords who are selling up, providing resources for homelessness prevention to local authorities, to NGOs, to make sure that people get the advice that they need, particularly if they've had an invalid notice to quit served on them, which is very common. And third, continuing to ramp up the supply of social housing. More built last year than any year since the 1970s, going to build even more this year.
Richard Boyd Barrett.
Taoiseach, once you enter into homelessness, it's very hard to get out of it. And I just want to respond to something you said earlier on. I've raised on multiple cases the case of a woman who's working, actually ironically looking after vulnerable children, who is in homeless accommodation with her son for 4 years, sharing a bedroom. That's what happens when you enter homelessness in many cases. It's very, very hard to get out. So it is absolutely imperative that you stop as many people ending up in that situation when they've done nothing wrong as possible. And let's be clear, while the eviction ban was on, yes, homelessness continued to increase, but it was at a much slower rate. 0.4% increase in children going into homelessness in November. What was it? Last month, 2.9%. In other words, it had more than quadrupled in the first month that you lifted the eviction ban. And to add to that, we are having landlords now, as I said, who are refusing the tenant in situ purchase, even though they're getting the right to evict on the grounds they're selling, and then the council says, will you sell to prevent this family being evicted? And they say no, because we can make more money by evicting them. Absolute greed. So are you going to recognise that lifting the ban has made the situation worse and give teeth to the purchase of tenant in situ scheme to prevent people going into homelessness?
Taoiseach.
Deputy, the truth is, any time you introduce a temporary measure, there comes a point where you have to end that temporary measure, and then you have a snapback or bounce back, or an effect where you see numbers rise. Minister Bryan made that very clear the week where he proposed that we have a temporary eviction ban, that there would be an uptick once it was lifted. That's inevitable, unfortunately, and is one of the problems, of course. So we had a short-term ban, which didn't reduce the number of emergency accommodation. The inevitable happened when it was lifted. Doesn't work in the medium term, doesn't work in the long term, and barely works in the short term. And that's what we've learned, I think, from the second eviction ban. From the first one, the circumstances were different. Pandemic restrictions were in place, and that is what actually reduced the numbers then, rather than the ban being in place. But Deputy, I agree with you on one thing. The best thing we can do is to prevent people from ending up in homelessness in the first place, and that's why we're going to power and repower the 10 situ scheme, make sure it works. It's why we're continuing to build more social housing. It's why we're funding local authorities and NGOs to engage with people so they know their rights and we can prevent them becoming homeless in the first place.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy.